Now, Pastor's already recognized the veterans. How many of those veterans have stood besides my brother and I? Is there any other Marines here? Whatever. That's the few, just one. I don't know what that means, but, it's really good to be back in Texas. My wife and I have been in a ministry called Teen Challenge for 35 years. We started back in Nebraska and Iowa, and this past summer, I was back in Nebraska around the 4th of July doing some God and Country services. And now I have a friend in western Nebraska, Ewing, Nebraska. Do we have any world travelers here who have ever been to Ewing, Nebraska? 150 population? Okay. You can't get there from here. It's you have to purpose to go there. And I was in Nebraska speaking, and this guy was driving me to another church, and I said, "Hey, I've got a friend. I've been gone for 19 years, and when I met Art Thompson, he was a rancher in western Nebraska. Had I think it was like in his late 70s. So now he's like 90 years old, and so I said, hey, I've got a friend that, he doesn't live in downtown Ewing. He kind of lives in the suburbs. He's kind of out of town. And I said, do you mind if we just stop by his house? I haven't seen him for a long time. He said, sure. And so we drove out there, out to the small place he had outside of Ewing. And we drove in the driveway, and Art was coming out of the barn, had some pig slop, and just walking along and didn't recognize the car. So I got out. Hey, Art. He got real excited, come up, hugged me and everything. Come on in, let's have some lemonade, which is good because it was hot in Nebraska. And so we're sitting there talking. Now, when I met Art, when he's in his 70s, he had never been outside the state of Nebraska, never traveled, never got on a plane in his life. And so we're sitting there talking. He was so excited. He said, Brother Roger, I've got to tell you what happened to me this last fall. He said, I heard about this International Farmers and Ranchers Convention in Dallas, Texas. So I drove to Lincoln, Nebraska, got on a plane, flew to Dallas, Texas, and you got there. And the first day he walked around downtown Dallas like this. I mean, they don't have grain silos that big, and the convention was at the Dallas Hyatt Regency, and because I know you guys are Christian, nobody watches TV, but the Dallas Hyatt is like a ball, it's a very prominent part of the Dallas skyline, and so he was there. Well, they had the first day of the conference, they had the first workshop, and after the first workshop, they had their first coffee break. Now, I don't know here in metropolitan Houston. I don't know if if you know anything about farmers and ranchers, but they like their coffee breaks, and so and they had more people at the conference than what they had expected. So they're bringing chairs from other rooms and they're putting them around a table. So here's Art. He's sitting at this round table. It was supposed to have like 6 or 7 people. There's like 10 guys crammed around this table, and ladies, you know what guys are like that don't know each other, right? I mean, they're just sitting there drinking their coffee, kind of looking around. One guy was counting the light bulbs in the chandelier above the table, and another guy was reading the exciting information about ducks on the back of the sugar packets, And so here's Art, he's like 90 years old, never been anywhere, and he's sitting there thinking, man, I want to meet people. I want to find out what's going on. So Art turns to the center of the table and begins telling them about his ranch. All 87 acres, the old Ford tractor, corn crib propped up with a couple 2x4s, a couple cows, duck, and a pig. But he's excited. And when he gets done talking, the guy across the table said, so you really love that place up there in Nebraska. So I'll tell you what, me and the little missus, we wouldn't want to live anywhere else. And the guy goes, wow, that's cool. That's neat. So they started talking, and so as he starts talking, he looks to the guy next to him, starts talking. So where are you from? He's at Texas. I'm a rancher here in Texas. And so he goes, wow. He said, well, in Nebraska, we hear about Texas all the time. And tell me about your ranch. And the guy's ears turned red, looked like Ross Perot. Ears turned red. He said, well, it's just a ranch. It's fine for my family. And he's drinking his coffee, And Art's sitting there going he just bared his soul, told him everything. And he says, no, really, I would really like to know about your ranch. And now the guy's face turns red, And he says, well, it's probably more than adequate for my family and I. And he just kind of looks away, and man, Art, he's just really chomping the bit now. I said, no, really, just, can you tell me about your place? And so the guy looks around, everybody's talking to other people. So he leans over to Art and he says, I'll tell you what. He said, if I get up early in the morning and when the sun is coming up in the east, he said, if I get in my pickup truck and if I drive until the sun is going down in the west, I can almost get to the other side of my property. Art smiles and says, yeah. He said, yeah, I got a pickup truck just like that. You know? And so, well, anyway, now, Pastor mentioned my book. What I real quickly, shamelessly commercial, this is, I said, I'd never heard of this, Time to Kill, Time to Heal. Well, this is about my 3 tours of duty in Vietnam, about being blown apart, shot twice, bayonet burned, and left to die. And I know that doesn't sound like much of a book, does it? But it's only $15, and after, for what I've been through, that's not very much. So you can get that out there in their CDs. Now, this is my first time to the book, so I need to explain to you, if you buy a book or a tape this morning, I want you to know the proceeds from this goes to feed hungry children. Mine are at home right now really hungry, and hope that you buy a book. I was thinking about, how to talk about all these. Today is the Marine Corps' 238th birthday, and he read that quote from General Lejeune in 1921. I remember that speech like it was yesterday. Actually, no, I don't feel a day over 66. But, trying to reflect back and see, I just turned, well, he did too. Just turned 66 last month. And finally, now that I'm 66, I realize I can now reflect back from life from an adult perspective. And I look back at, all the stuff that happened growing up. Now that I'm an adult, I recognize that, none of that really affected me all that much. Growing up in a dysfunctional, broken home with alcoholic parents, I didn't know, that was not a word I learned in the Marine Corps, dysfunctional. I had to look it up in a dictionary, and there was our family picture there, so that helped. But, and I realized that didn't help, didn't hurt me all that much growing up. But my mom leaving my brother and I, when we were 4 years old and being placed in an orphanage, that didn't really affect me all that much either. And all this stuff that happened, now that I'm an adult, I realized it really didn't affect me all that much. And so really, Ron and I grew up, just another basically well-adjusted American young people. And 1965, we were downtown. And now I have to be, this is embarrassing. I made it through high school by Grace Agnew. She was our principal, and she wanted me out there just as soon as possible. But my brother was the smartest of the two of us, but we were downtown, still in school in 1965, and I just remember looking at Ron and say, Ron, let's join the Marine Corps. And of course, he was the smartest of the two of us until that day, and he goes, okay, so we went down the Marine Corps recruiting office, and my favorite poster on the door, the Marines are looking for a few good men. Went inside anyway and signed up, to join the United States Marine Corps, and went from high school graduation to Marine Corps boot camp. Let me tell you, some sports fans, that is a shock to your system. But I will tell you what, I found what I was looking for. See, I was always told I'd never amount to anything. I was stupid. I'd never be able to do anything. And I joined the Marine Corps because I was going to prove to those people that I was going to make something of my life. And then in boot camp, or after boot camp and infantry training, in 1965, I volunteered to go to Vietnam. Now, in 1965, I was afraid that Vietnam was going to be over before I got there. I learned later I had plenty of time, but I didn't know that then. And so I volunteered to go, and we began training because we were both only 17, and you can't go to combat until you're 18. So we began training for combat. And when I shipped out to Vietnam, I knew, that we were prepared. I knew what combat was all about. It's kind of like when you get married. No, you're getting ahead of me over there. What I mean by that is when you get married, you think you know what you're doing, but you really don't. But that's another message. I'll leave that for your pastor. So, I knew what combat was about because I had seen John Wayne in the sands of Iwo Jima 3 times. And there's a couple mature men here today like Ron and I that remember Tuesday night with Vic Morrow on combat. So see, I thought that I was prepared for Vietnam, that the Marine Corps had really trained us. And so that I was not prepared the way I thought it was for that first baptism of fire when my company of 219 Marines walked into a 650-man battalion of Viet Cong regulars. And in one 45-minute firefight, my company of 219 Marines was reduced to 78 men that had not been killed or wounded. My best friend Danny was killed standing right next to me. My platoon sergeant, a Korean War veteran, was killed on the other side of me. And in that short firefight, my life changed dramatically. And and I know some of you, if you've lost a loved one, somebody close to you, there's a process that we have to go through. It's called the grieving process. And if you don't go through that grieving process, you're not going to be healthy. But the thing about Vietnam is that you had to keep your emotions under control, because if you got too emotional, you could get yourself or somebody else killed. And so you had to take all those emotions and just stuff them down inside. And so I did that for 2 tours in Vietnam. I was wounded twice, and as I, that kept thinking about that day that I was going to come home, I knew inside that was never going to happen, because men continued to die around me. But finally, summer of 1967, I got on a helicopter after an all-night battle on a small little outpost on a DMZ, literally fighting hand-to-hand for my life. 48 hours later, Ron and I were in our living room, and, we were home, and we were safe. But this was 1967, and when Ron and I joined in 1965, feeling that we were doing the right thing, that we were serving our country, by 1967, something had happened in America. And most of you are too young to understand that, but Vietnam was the first war that came into our living rooms every single night. At conferences that I've ministered at, I've met people who saw their son die on evening news before they ever notified by the Pentagon. I've met women who saw their husband fall in battle before they ever heard about it through a telegram. And Vietnam came into our living rooms. But the problem was that what we saw was a distorted picture of Vietnam. Now, no war is good. And we made mistakes in Vietnam, just like every other war that we've ever been involved in. But, we saw a distorted picture. So when I came home, and I had all this stuff, there's just some things I just wanted to kind of get off my chest. I just wanted to talk about. But by 1967, much of America had become embarrassed by Vietnam. And our family said, Ron, we're glad you're okay. We're glad you made it home safe. But this Vietnam thing, it's a little awkward. So let's do this. Let's just not talk about it. And let's just pretend like it didn't happen. Let's just get on with our life. Well, that sounded good to me. I was glad to be alive. And getting on with my life sounded good. Forgetting about it, that was a little bit more difficult, because you see, at night, when I would lay down and I would close my eyes, I would remember all over again. But the good part about it, I was still in the Marine Corps. And Ron and I were surrounded by men just like us who had been through. And there was that camaraderie. There was that fellowship, that knowing, that understanding. And so we were surrounded by people who had experienced that. And so 3 years later, I did a year and a half as a drill instructor. I did not want to be a drill instructor. That wasn't my personality. Of course, my wife said you didn't have a personality, but I didn't want to be. And so that was, I did that. I was a CID, a criminal investigator. Think Leroy Jethro Gibbs with a lot less pay, and did that for about over another year and a half. 3 years later, 1970, I volunteered to go back to Vietnam, and say this guy volunteered to go to Vietnam 3 times. He is not the brightest bulb in the box, is he? And but in 1970, when I volunteered to go back, and I didn't recognize it, our country had changed so dramatically in that 5 years. You see, I got tired of when I put my uniform on and went somewhere, some peace protester who wanted to kill me for peace. That was always an interesting experience, and people who I'd never met before, calling me things like murderer and baby killer, when I knew that I hadn't done anything wrong. And so in 1970, I volunteered to go back to Vietnam. There were 2 reasons. The obvious one was the one I just mentioned, but there was another one more subtle that I didn't recognize for a long time. And it's not something just combat veterans suffer. In New York City, September 11, 2001, there are people who are struggling with this when, when the towers came down and everyone in the office next to them died and they got out alone. When a tornado takes away your neighbor's house and kills the whole family and your house is untouched. Or when you're in a car accident, and the person sitting next to you is killed and you get out of the car alive. It's called survivor's guilt. It's not just combat veterans that struggle with it, but I did not realize that inside I felt guilty because men better than me had not come home at all. And so I volunteered to go back to Vietnam. July 11th, 1970, I was an acting platoon leader. I was on a search and destroy mission in South Vietnam, leading my patrol when suddenly, walking across the field, a grenade went off at my feet. I got up. I was shot twice. And as I was laying on the ground, a North enemy soldier run his bayonet through my stomach as I was laying on the ground. You know, this is a nightmare. This was not real. My mind was trying to comprehend everything that was happening. It was happening so quickly. And I remember struggling to my feet and trying to move back to where my men were. And I had blood all over my face. And I remember taking a few steps and falling to the ground and struggling to my feet and taking another couple steps and falling again. And finally, I just fell to the ground and I couldn't move. And I remember rolling over, looking up into the sky. Vietnam is an incredibly beautiful country, you know, and I'm looking up in a clear blue sky and watching the green palm trees in the breeze and this emerald green rice paddies that rippled in the wind. And as I lay there on the ground, all of a sudden, pain, like I had never experienced in my life, began to rack my body. I was 22 years old, 3 months from my 23rd birthday. And as I lay on that ground, I was tired. I was tired of the death and destruction and pain, and I just wanted it to be over. And then all of a sudden, I was being drug across that field. A 20-year-old Navy corpsman and a 19-year-old Marine Lance Corporal ran out across that field and began pulling me to safety. I remember the doctor, my corpsman, trying to stop the bleeding. I remember the helicopter landing in in a dry rice paddy, and they threw me in the back of this big supply helicopter. And I remember the door gunner looking over at me, shaking his head and looking away and never looking back. 15-minute flight to 95th Army Evac Hospital, China Beach, Da Nang. They rushed me into triage. The smells of burnt flesh and blood, and I was not the only casualty there, things that I'll never forget. And I remember the doctor putting the mask on my face and saying, "Son, we're taking you down to surgery." And I remember over the next few days being in and out of consciousness in that hospital, but I'll never forget the 6 days. Ron was in the field. When he got back from his mission, they told him that I'd been wounded. They rushed him to the hospital in Da Nang, and I was laying in in that ward, intensive care ward. And I woke up and saw Ron walk past my bed. And he walked up to a doctor standing about 2 beds down. He said, "Excuse me," he said, "I'm Sergeant Helle's brother. Could you tell me how he's doing?" And not knowing I was conscious, the doctor looked at my brother and said, "Son," he said, "your brother's going to die. We've done everything that we can do." And then he stood there for a moment. He said, "Well, where is he?" And the doctor he said, "They told me he's in this ward, but I can't find him." And the doctor took him by the arm, and a nurse came on the other side of him and walked back to my bed, and they just stopped. And I was laying there, this mass of human rubble, torn apart from head to toe. My head the size of a basketball, my face all black and blue, my eyes black, didn't even tell that my eyes were open. And my brother just stood there for a moment with this blank look until the look of recognition came across his face, that he recognized that was me. And he started sobbing and crying. He started to take a step to my bed, and his legs gave out from underneath him. And he fell against the side of my bed. And I remember looking down. I couldn't talk. I couldn't move. I couldn't say anything. And as a 22-year-old young man, I felt a fear in my heart that was greater than anything that I had ever experienced in combat. And I remember being so afraid. And I remember just crying out in my heart and saying, "God, if there really is a God, if you let me live, I'll do anything you want." And I went to sleep. About 10 days later, the doctor took my brother aside one morning, and he said, "Ron," he said, "your brother's going to live." He said, "We think your being here is help, but he's pretty messed up." And it was another week after that before I was strong enough to survive the flight home. They put me on a medevac flight, and on the way to Yokosuka Naval Hospital in Japan, I started internal bleeding. I spent 5 weeks, 8 surgeries in Japan, put me on a medevac flight to Great Lakes Hospital outside of Chicago. Got to the receiving triage room there. They were changing bandages. The doctor said, "Son, you got gangrene in your right leg, and it's going to have to come off." But somehow it didn't. You know, the gangrene went away. One of the bullets, one bullet hit me in the stomach, one shattered my elbow, and they found a bone infection. They said, we're going to have to amputate your arm. But I woke up in recovery. I was holding my arm and my hand, and those Navy guys, you know how they are. I thought, they didn't want to throw the parts away, but, my fingers. And, so... all this stuff began to happen. And the doctors said, okay, son, you're going to be here for about 2 years, maybe more, because we're going to have to do surgery, therapy, recovery. And we're going to do more surgery, therapy, recovery. My legs are shattered. We're going to put pins and plates in your legs. You're going to have to wear leg braces. You're going to have about 15% use of your right arm. You got shrapnel in your eyes. You're going to go blind. And you have some other injuries. You won't be able to have any children. So on and on they went to encourage me. And... 27 operations, 4 plastic surgery operations later, I walked out of the hospital. And on the outside, I looked okay. I got a job with Pinkerton Detective Agency and was working for them, working my way up the ladder, but there was a time of day that I hated. See, it was a time of day when there was no more cases to work on. There was a time of day when the bars were closed. There was no place to go for fellowship. It was a time of day when I finally had to go home. And when I'd go home, I'd have to go to bed. And when I go to bed, I'd have to go to sleep. And when I go to sleep, I'd be standing in the field. And I can't get away until that grenade goes off and I wake up soaking wet in sweat. And if I could go to sleep again, I would see Danny, my buddy, looking up at me through lifeless eyes. And I would relive that over and over and over again for 4.5 years. I'd been out of the hospital less than a year when I met my wife, Shirley, and convinced her I was normal. We got married 11 months later, and my company moved me from Indiana to Nebraska. And the next 2 years, my life began to unravel. And I put my wife through her own PTSD program until finally I hit rock bottom. 39 years this coming Thanksgiving, my wife looked at me and she said, I love you, but I'm leaving because you're killing me too. And that's when God brought me to rock bottom. And in a small home fellowship one night, they were going around the room, it was a home group fellowship, and, they had the icebreaker questions. You know what those are? Those are the questions that try to make you feel comfortable when you already know that you're not comfortable with those kind of people. And they were going around the room, and the last question was, when was God real in your life? And church, had never happened before or since, but it was like I was lifted up out of that room, and I was looking down another room, and I saw a man all bloody and bleeding, and heard him say, God, if there really is a God, if you let me live, I'll do anything you want. And I was back in that room. It was like a mirror in front of my face, and I saw a phony. I said, God had spared me. Why? And my wife and I were only separated for 10 days, and we got together just to talk. And she looked at me, and she said, these people have something we don't. She said, unless we put God first, we're not going to make it. And, something inside just resonated. See, I'd been reading the Bible. And, you ever, when I don't know if you understand this, because I'm like I said, I'm not the brass bulb in a box, but, I started reading the Bible. We were going to church and stuff, and when without Jesus, it's like you're reading somebody else's mail. And that morning, before my wife and I got together, I was in Jeremiah, and I was just reading down the page, and all of a sudden this little verse just leaped off the page, read me. And it said, you will know me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. And that night, we went back to Shirley's house, to her apartment, and we knelt on the floor by her bed, and I cried out to that God that I thought I knew from a broken heart. And I said, God, what's missing? And the still, small voice of the Holy Spirit said, Rod, surely it's not what's missing, it's who's missing. You need Jesus. And that night, in an apartment with just my wife, and crying out to God from a broken heart, he took all the pain and nightmares of Vietnam. And for the first time in 4.5 years, I slept like a little baby. And he took all that away and then began to heal my broken and wounded heart. And I say, Raj, thank you for sharing that story. I didn't know you were that old. That's going to really apply to my life. As we close this time that we have this morning, friends, the only reason that I can share this story to you, some of you know, Vietnam veterans, 40, 45 years later, they still can't talk about it. World War II veterans, Korean veterans who still cannot share their experience. Why? Because it's still too painful. But let me say something as we close this service this morning. In our culture today, you don't have to go to Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan to be wounded. There are some people in this room this morning that are just as wounded on the inside as I was wounded on the outside. There are women here this morning who have been used, abused, misused. There are men here today that you are trying to be successful in your life. You're trying to prove you're going to make something of your life, and no matter what you do, what you try, nothing seems to be good enough. You know, I said I had 4 plastic surgery operations on my face. I didn't always look this good. For 4.5 years in the morning when I would get up and I would look in the mirrors, I did not see what the surgeons had done. I still saw the wounds because I didn't like me. And this morning, if I could stand before each and every one of you, just look you in the face and say, hi, do you like you? You go, well, that's easy for you to say. No. But I want to tell you this morning that there's a God in heaven who knows your hurt, and he loves you with an unconditional love. And there's some of you as Christians that you've been hurt by other people that said, just because you have faith in Christ does not mean in this world today that you might not be hurt, that you might not be wounded. And I'm standing here today. I live in Ringgold, Georgia. Any world travelers? Ringgold? That God brought Roger Helle from Ringgold, Georgia, to Tomball, Texas, to tell you that there's a God in heaven who loves you, who wants to heal you, who wants to take away the pain, the rejection, the fear, the guilt, the memory of that abortion, that memory of that abuse, the memory of that failure. He wants to heal your broken heart. Would you stand with me this morning as we close this service? Now, this morning it is my prayer that when you leave here today, you not remember the story of a man, but a God that loves you so much that he would send his son to die for you. And even if you've already come to faith in Christ, if you've not come to faith in Christ, I pray that something that was shared this morning, that you will realize how much he loves you, and you will not leave here the same as when you came in. But if you know, even if you're a Christian, but there's, as I've been sharing, the memory of rejection, of fear, of pain, of your own nightmares, of battles that you struggle with. I'm here to tell you this morning, there's a God who loves you so much that he wants to heal your broken, wounded heart. And all he asks is that you open up your heart to him and allow him by his. The only reason I can tell this story is because 39 years ago, Jesus Christ came into a heart that was wounded and infected and full of hate and guilt and pain and fear. But he healed it by his Spirit. He took all that pain away, and I can stand before you today healed and whole. Not because of anything I did, but because of his goodness. Let's pray. Father, in this room this morning, God, there are wounded people. Father, there are wounded people of faith that know you, and there are people, Lord, who have not, Lord, they hear about this God of love. They've heard about your love and passion, but Father, they've never experienced it yet for themselves. God, I pray in these closing moments right now, Father, that we lift our hearts to you and we say, God, here I am. I'm hurting this morning. Father, I'm hearing that you love me and that you want to heal me and that you want to touch me. And Lord, I'm hearing this testimony. So Father, in faith today, I'm going to open up my heart. I'm going to ask you, Lord, to touch me. I'm giving you my guilt, my fear, my unforgiveness, my bitterness. I'm giving it to you. And now, Lord, I pray you fill my heart with your Spirit. You cleanse my broken heart. Wrap your arms of love around me. And Lord, let the healing process begin. And Father, when that happens, we'll be very sure to give you all the praise and all the glory, because we ask all this thing in your name. Amen. God bless you. Have a great day. It was good to be with you this morning.